Thank you to the VBA for inviting me to conduct this breakout session on successfully managing risk. A big welcome to you all and thank you for attending. I understand we've got a large number of people who have logged into this particular breakout session, so that's great. Risk is alive and well. One of the things obviously we're faced with is the increasing number of challenges within building control, and it's becoming increasingly important, of course, that we do understand these challenges and the risk exposures that we're currently facing with, and to put things in place to manage them. So welcome again. Of course, you know, with so many people participating in the session, there's probably a number of you who have experience with risk. Perhaps there's others who are less experienced with risk. And so I'm hopeful that at the end of the session, you'll all have got something out of it. We've got approximately, I'll get through the slides. There's a bit of information to get through, so I'm intending to get through it reasonably quickly to allow for some questions at the end. But again, I hope you find it very interesting. Really, the purpose of the session is just to provide you with some guidance and some understanding of some key concepts and tools that you can use when managing risk. So the session itself, we'll start just by looking at some context first. What are some of the challenges that you're faced with as building surveyors? And then we'll look at what is risk as well, because it's important that we actually get a common understanding of what risk actually is and some of the key relationships in risk management. So we start the session with a common understanding. We'll then look at the many benefits of risk management, and there are a number. It just makes good business sense at the end of the day. I've been doing risk management consulting now for over, I guess, 25 years. And, you know, often you're running workshops and people roll their eyes at the thought of risk, and, you know, risk is, you know, can be pretty dull in some eyes. And I guess I can understand that to a point, but I also see the benefits that we can achieve by having a really effective risk management programs. So we'll look at some of those benefits. Then we'll start digging a little bit deeper into, you know, just how we go about managing risk. We'll look at risk frameworks, and then we'll look at some examples of risk register. Because the risk register, and again, I'll assume a lot of you are familiar with risk registers. You may have used them in the past or at least heard of them. But a risk register is essentially an outcome of the risk process. And so we'll look at a risk register, an example of that. And it's a tool that you can use after this session as well to go back to your own workplace. So that's a session that we'll be running through. As I said, a bit of information to get through. So starting with some of the challenges, and the folks who have joined this session will know, obviously better than anyone, of some of the challenges that you're currently facing. And this is particularly targeted at the private building surveyors. With insurance, obviously there's been significant increases in professional indemnity premiums and excesses in recent years. And this is particularly significant for the sole practitioners out there in terms of private building surveyors. Of course, there's real exposures if you don't understand contracts right, and so you need to understand the detail to reduce that exposure. So there's risks associated with that, as are risks associated with your pricing and not getting that right. So you need to ensure that your pricing for projects is accurate and you're accounting for all your costs. Of course, there's accepting information in good faith in the preparation of building permits, for example, which is risk exposure. And of course, there's also the new Code of Conduct for Building Surveyors that was released, I think, back in January this year. So there's a number of things in that which we'll look at in a couple of slides' time, which you need to consider also in terms of challenges and managing risk. But at the end of the day, with all these challenges, you know, I ask these three questions here now. Do you understand all your key risks and your business exposures? And are you focusing your mitigation efforts in the right areas? And then are you providing confidence to stakeholders, you know, for example, insurers? Because by managing risks well, understanding your mitigation efforts and applying those in the right areas, you're going to be able to provide confidence to your stakeholders. So they're just some of the challenges which, as I said, I'm sure you all know very well. So what is risk? By definition, risks are uncertainties which, if they occur, will negatively affect the achievement of your objectives. They may or may not happen. You know, what can stop you achieving what you need to? It's a very simple way of looking at risk, pardon me, but it's important that we do have a good understanding of what risk is, because when we come to identify risk, if we don't get that right, that part of the risk process right, then it means that a lot of the other information that we collect along the way becomes perhaps irrelevant or not meaningful. So it's important that we do identify risks properly, and to do that we need to understand what actually a risk is. So therefore, what is risk management? It's essentially the practice of identifying potential risks in advance, analysing them and taking action to avoid or reduce the risk. It makes sense. Identify them in advance before they happen, analyse them for priority, because we can't focus all our efforts onto all risks that we identify. So we need to analyse them to work out which ones are higher priority, and then taking action to avoid or reduce them. We all want to achieve risk management success, and that's only really possible through two key components working together. Firstly, we need to have tailored and practical a risk policy, organisational arrangements and processes. And I'll be going through this in a minute to give you a bit more detail on that. But also we need to have a positive culture around leadership attitudes and behaviours. Both those together will ensure risk management, will give you the best opportunity to achieve risk management success. You can't have one without the other. You can't have a set of great documents and policies and procedures without positive culture. And you'll see that application in your own workplaces, I'm sure, from time to time, where you might have all the best documents, but they're sitting on the shelf, but there's no leadership attitudes or behaviours shown around them. So again, both those together will give you the best opportunity to achieve risk management success. The benefits, there's a number of benefits in doing it right and understanding and managing your risk well. Organisations have long understood the need to identify and manage risks. If you identify your risks and understand, there's obviously going to be fewer surprises. It certainly contributes to improved decision making and performance. It contributes to the achievement of objectives, because if we remember the definition of risk, it's something that can impact you achieving your objectives. So clearly, effective risk management will contribute to your achieving objectives. Certainly improves organisational governance and due diligence. You're able to demonstrate understanding of risk and report those through, and make people, increase people's confidence that you are managing risk well. And of course, it will contribute to regulatory compliance and adherence to the codes, but it provides trust and confidence to stakeholders, for example, for insurance. When you're managing risk well, it just gives that extra level of trust and confidence. So they're just some of the benefits pretty quickly. As I mentioned, of course, there's a new code of practice for building surveyors. One of the key aims of the code is to promote public trust and confidence. There's a number of things within the code. There's a number of elements within the code that are potential exposures if you don't address them correctly or appropriately. And I've just got some lists here. There's a potential for non-compliance, of course, with the Building Act and the regs. There's a potential for fraudulent activity. There's a possibility that building surveyors have inappropriate skills, knowledge and experience. There's also the potential exposure of conflict between a consultant building surveyor and relevant building surveyor. Of course, there's always communication with stakeholders through audits and investigations, and so you're exposed if you don't get that correct. And of course, there's always the possibility of some complaints as well. So again, applying basic risk management principles and practices will help you certainly to adhere to the code of practice as you identify these exposures and put things in place to manage them. But at the end of the day, proactive risk management just becomes part of your day-to-day administrative processes. In terms of the risk framework, so now we're drilling into a little bit more detail on the risk itself. There is an international standard on risk management, ISO 31000, and it looks, and a lot of organisations, or most organisations that I've worked with over the last 25, 30 years, will certainly align their risk frameworks to the international standards. So a framework largely comprises two elements. There's the organisational arrangements, which I like to refer to it as, and that includes your risk policy, roles, responsibilities, communication, making sure that you're communicating risk to the internal and external stakeholders if appropriate. In terms of roles, responsibilities, it's important that we have those clearly defined and people are aware of their roles and accountabilities as far as risk. And with any good business process, of course, we need to have monitoring and review mechanisms in place. And when all that's achieved, we're then able to report performance. So that's the organisational arrangements. Then the next element or component of the risk framework is the risk process. And this is what's probably a bit more familiar to people in the session today, starting with the risk context. And that's just really before you undertake a risk assessment, understanding what the assessment is going to be, what's the scope around it, just confirm what are the objectives that you're actually trying to achieve as a business, because that helps you identify the risks into the next stage. So with risk identification, that's obviously one of the key things we need to do is to identify our risks. And I've got that written down in or described in three elements. First, that first box is clear we need to describe the risk, but then it's really important to identify what's causing the risk as well. And we can list a number of causes for a particular risk. And it's important we do this because if we can actually manage or mitigate the causes, it might mean that we end up with no risk at all, which would be great, or at least we reduce the risk. So it's good to identify causes of risk so we can then hopefully reduce or avoid altogether the risk from occurring. It's important also that we describe the impacts of the risk should it occur. So from risk identification, we go on to the next stage of the risk process, which is risk analysis. And here's we identify what we're currently doing to manage these particular risks. There could be a number of controls you've got around procedures and policies. There could be some training that you undertake regularly. So these are all examples of current controls that you have to manage the particular risks that you've identified. And then go on to our first risk assessment. Again, some of you in the session today will have been exposed to consequence and likelihood. But we look at the consequence of the risk actually, if it does happen, what are the consequences? And then the likelihood, if the risk was to occur, how likely do we expect it to occur? And then a combination of our consequence and likelihood gives us our risk rating, and it could be extreme or it could be moderate or it could be low, ideally. Once we've worked out our current risk rating, then we move on to the next stage. And this stage, risk evaluation, is probably I've found working with a range of organisations, both public and private sector over the years, is the part of the risk process that's least well understood and adopted. It's risk evaluation. Some of you may have heard about risk appetite and risk tolerance. It's really important because this risk evaluation stage helps us determine if we want to accept the risk or not. For example, after we've done our current risk rating and determined that, we might actually accept that risk. And this is where risk appetite and risk evaluation stage comes in. So it's really important for decision making because it dictates then what type of risk treatment that we need to do into the future, which is our last box here in terms of risk treatment. So risk treatment essentially means coming up with a range of actions and things that you need to do in the future to further reduce that risk. And once we've identified those, then we can again do a second risk assessment of consequence and likelihood to end up with a treated risk rating. So obviously the objective is if we have a current risk rating of extreme, for example, and we've applied a whole range of really good risk treatments and actions, we want that extreme current risk rating to be reduced to, let's say, a moderate or even a low, ideally, a low treated risk rating. Some organisations won't necessarily do that second assessment, but I always encourage clients to do it because it really does show the benefit of implementing risk treatment, and it helps justify if you can show that you've reduced a risk from extreme to high, extreme to low. It really helps justify the expense that you need to go to sometimes with implementing these additional risk treatments. I'll skip that one because I've captured in this next slide as well. So this is an example of a risk register. I've seen many complicated ones, many very simple ones, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter which one you choose to use as long as it works for your organisation. And very simply, the risk register just reflects or just captures the information that I've just gone through. So you see the first column is the risk. And in this particular, and I've just got a couple of examples here, hopefully relevant. And I just said inappropriate approval of a building permit. So that's the risk. That may or may not happen. There could be a number of causes for that risk to occur. For example, there's insufficient documentation received for review. There could be a number of impacts associated with that if this risk occurs. There could be litigation. There could be reputation damage. And when you look at what you currently have in place to manage that risk, you might have some PI insurance. Then we move across to our current risk assessment as it stands at the moment. So we've determined our consequence to be a 5 or an extreme, and some of you might be aware or have seen before a 5x5 risk matrix that is often used in in risk analysis and risk assessments. It's very qualitative, where a 5 is worst case and a 1 is preferred or best case, if you like. So in this particular example, we've determined this risk to have a consequence of a 5, and let's say it's an extreme, and that's on that bottom axis. We've determined that the likelihood of this risk occurring, it's possible that it might occur. So we give that a rating of 3. So a consequence and likelihood together from that risk matrix, a 5 and a 3 gives us a 15, or a yellow, a medium. So that's where we're currently sitting for this particular risk. We decide in our evaluation stage that we might not accept that risk, or we don't accept that risk. And so we need to do something else. And so this is when we think, okay, what other treatments can we put in place? What are the potential actions can we put in place to reduce this risk from a medium? And one of the things, for example, you might decide to implement some quality systems to help you manage this risk of inappropriate approval of building permits. And by doing that, we can actually reduce our consequence from a 5 to a 4, and our likelihood goes from a 3 to a 2. So we end up with a treated rating, treated being after risk treatment, of low. So again, I find it really useful, and I always recommend to clients to actually do that second stage of risk assessment, because they can see the benefit in implementing that treatment, of implementing quality systems, because you actually move the risk from a medium to a low. So I've gone through some information fairly quickly. That comes to the end of the slides in terms of what I actually wanted to present in the short time that we have. There's a lot of information. Some of it might be new. Some of it a lot of you may have seen that before. But essentially what we've gone through is looked at some of the challenges that you're currently facing, and then the importance of implementing really good, robust risk management systems to help you actually manage them going ahead, some of these challenges that you're facing. We looked at the risk framework again, which is based on international standards, and then the risk register, which is a tool, and you can use this tool in your own workplace after this, going forward. So that's well, there I am. So that's thank you for joining and participating, and I'll ask Amy if there's been any questions that have come through.
Yeah, Michael, we do have a question here. It is, how well does an ISO 31000 management system scale down for smaller businesses with limited resources?
I think the last bit, how well does it scale down?
Yep, for smaller businesses with limited resources. Yep.
Yeah, great question. As I said before, there's a lot of frameworks that are really complicated and really detailed because they need it. They need to be that way. But for a small business, you can easily take, and the standard just provides guidance really. And I've worked with a number of organisations who are considered small, that we apply the principle and the guidance information from ISO. So you might only select some components of the standard to use. Again, it's what's best for you. And I always talk to clients about making sure that it's your risk response and your risk approach is really practical. So to answer questions simply, absolutely, you can scale down the standard, the international standard, to any size business, and that's the beauty of it. It's only guidance material really. It's not that prescriptive. And because of that, you are able to scale either up or down.
Great, thank you, Michael. We do have another one that's just popped in. Could you comment on the implementation of ISO 9001 as a risk management mitigation tool?
Oh, that's a quality system. And certainly having a quality system in place will be one of those controls that you would need to have in place to help you manage risk exposures. And so I see the quality standard and quality systems as just another tool or another control that you have in place to help you manage risk. So really important. Some organisations will have better developed quality systems than others, of course, but it's really important in helping manage risk. Now, whether it's certified to 9001 or whether you've developed a quality system that's just aligned to the standard, but whatever the case, it's really good to have, depending again on the organisation, it's really good to have those quality controls in place, because that will certainly help you manage a number of your risk exposures, I'd expect.
Perfect, thank you. And another one here, which is not quite a question, more of a comment. You might be able to comment back to it. It's just from Lucas. Interesting that adhering to the new building surveyor's code of conduct is noted as a risk.
I'm not sure if adhering to it is a risk, and if that's how I communicated it, it's may have miscommunicated. I guess all I was saying in that is that adhering to the code, there are probably some exposures in there, what the code's actually requiring, and so just by adhering to the code, there may be some things within that are exposures to yourself. As I said before, whether it be through compliance with the regs, the Act and the regs, or fraudulent activity, whatever it is. But there may be areas within the code of practice that you go, yeah, I haven't quite got that under control. I need to identify that as a risk and put some things in place to help me adhere to the code.
Perfect, thank you. Now, I'll just remind you, if you do have a question for Michael, just use the Q&A button on your screen. We don't have any more questions at the moment, Michael, but is there any common questions you get in this area that you may be able to explain here?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Look, something that I see quite often, I'll go to organisations, as a risk consultant, and the first comment will be, look, we've done a risk register, but we're not showing any signs of, it's just not improving our we get it out every year. We do an annual review of our risk register, and we find our extreme risks are still extreme, and nothing's happening. Why is that? And so you don't have to drill into it too much to come up with some of the reasons why risk programs aren't as effective as what they could be. And one of the things is, and I've already mentioned in this presentation, that it's one thing to have a risk framework and a risk register, but there's another thing to have the right culture and the right attitudes and behaviours towards it as well. So for organisations who claim we're not seeing much change in our risk register, it's all pretty dull and boring and all that sort of thing, I get it. But one of the very key reasons for that is there hasn't been a lot of commitment to it and leadership shown to actually make it work. So it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle, if you like, because unless your register is showing performance and people are showing improvement in performance, people will start, sort of tuning off to it and viewing it as an irrelevant piece of administration that they have to do. Whereas others companies who embrace it, who do their actions and their treatments on time, will see the residual risk, the treated risk rating that we were talking about before. If it ends up being a low, and we start off with a high, by the time you implement more treatments, that current high risk is starting to reduce. So it ends up being the same as that treated risk rating. So it needs to be active. And that's one of the key things that, I talk about with clients a lot is the need to keep it alive, to keep reviewing, to make sure that people are doing their treatments to that commitment in action, really. And then you see the performance improving, and then you see action. And that's what keeps people really enthused. And obviously all the benefits that I spoke about earlier, all the benefits achieved with the program. So that's certainly a thing.
Fantastic. We do have another one in here, Michael. Have you been involved with a surveying firm in a risk management capacity? And if you were, as a result, was there a reduction in PI premiums? If so, how much?
Yeah. Wow. No, the answer is I haven't been. I've actually just started doing some work with municipal building surveyors at the moment, and it'll be interesting to see in terms of developing some frameworks and things for municipal building surveyors and training them. But to answer the question, I haven't been involved with building control. I've worked a lot in government and a lot with private industry, but as yet I haven't had any exposure directly with building surveyors until this recent project with Municipal Building Surveyor Group.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Michael. It's been fantastic to have you here at the Building Surveyors Conference. I think we're wrapping up this breakout session. I've learned a lot. It was a great presentation. So thanks again for being here with us at this conference.
Thank you, Amy. We'll just finish by, if anyone has any questions or follow up after this, obviously my contact details are there. And if you need any assistance with your risk management programs, please don't hesitate. But thank you, and thanks for joining. I hope you all got something out of it.